Hi, I'm Tom Mauser. I'm the father of Daniel Mauser, one of the students killed at Columbine High School in 1999. Ever since then, I've been an advocate for stronger gun laws in America. And over the years, I've heard a number of gun rights activists criticize victims like myself who speak out, criticizing us for relying only on emotion or not being qualified to speak about guns. This happened recently, earlier this year, when I was at the state capitol to do some testifying. And there were statements made by a man by the name of Frederick Calhoun from Aurora, Colorado. And I thought, you know, it's time I respond to remarks made by one of these folks. So I wrote a letter to Mr. Calhoun, and what I'd like to do is share my letter with you. Dear Mr. Calhoun, we spoke briefly on March 7th at the state capitol after your testimony before a House committee on the bill that would have repealed Colorado's high-capacity magazine limit. At that time, I expressed my irritation with your testimony. I would now like to respond in more detail because I thought your words were offensive towards victims of gun violence like myself who have become advocates for stronger gun laws. You're certainly not the first gun rights activist who has questioned the emotional state of mind or qualifications of victims who speak out. But yours was very public, so it's the one I've chosen to specifically respond to with the letter. I'd like to quote something you said as taken right from the recording of the hearing. What you said was, and I'm going to present this somewhat in the fashion that Mr. Calhoun does. Finally, it is unfortunate those who have lost loved ones by some horrible act of gun violence become blinded by emotion, anger, and frustration, and choose to seek closure by pushing for laws like this one that could turn unsuspecting, innocent, law-abiding gun owners into criminals. Nevertheless, while empathy for a person's loss is a noble human quality, adjudicating these laws requires that juries must consider the facts and evidence. End quote. Wow, where can I even begin on a quote like that? First, I find it interesting how you, like other gun rights activists, try to portray yourselves as unfortunate victims of a terrible injustice, wrongfully turned into unsuspecting criminals by laws pushed by victims of gun violence. Give me a break. It seems like you're trying to deflect empathy that people have towards victims by demonizing those victims. This magazine limit has been in place for nearly 3 years, yet neither you nor other testifiers presented any evidence of gun owners who've been wrongfully turned into criminals by this magazine law. It is not the intent of victims to make criminals out of law-abiding citizens. It is our intent to reduce the body count. It is our intent for law-abiding citizens to follow the law, even if they don't support the law. Isn't that what law-abiding citizens are supposed to do? More important though, I thought you had a lot of nerve to speak about victims being blinded by emotion, anger, and frustration, and seeking closure by passing laws that somehow harm innocent gun owners. Since you seem to think you know us so well, I have to ask, have you ever sat down and had heart-to-heart conversations with people who've lost loved ones to gun violence? I'm guessing you have not. So how can you claim to understand us? Do victims speak emotionally? Damn right they do. Would you expect anything less from someone who has needlessly lost a loved one? They're telling an emotional story. Would you expect them to give a wooden, emotionless presentation like the kind you use? Do victims have anger and frustration? Sure, many do. After all, they have needlessly lost a loved one in a country where such losses are at least 10 times more likely to happen than in all other developed nations. They've seen how difficult it is to pass common sense gun legislation, even when there's strong public support for it. But the point isn't whether victims speak with emotion, anger, and frustration. After all, since gun rights activists like to quote our founding fathers, I think it's reasonable to ask whether you think the founding fathers acted with emotion, anger, and frustration when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. Well, of course they did. But did that diminish what they wrote? Of course not. They had good reason to be emotional, angry, and frustrated. The real question is whether the person reacting with emotion, anger, and frustration also offers facts and evidence. I have heard victims offer facts and evidence, not just their story. But their story is part of the evidence. Just because some opponents claim that it's emotional doesn't make it any less a piece of evidence. When you testified, I mostly heard opinion. And I heard you make the ridiculous argument that if we limit high-capacity magazines, it could encourage mass killers to instead use more lethal means of killing, like homemade flamethrowers. Yes, that's right, folks. Look out for those homemade flamethrowers. That's what they're going to turn to. Unbelievable. I just have to add, during the testimony about the flamethrowers, he went into sickening detail about how he estimates what would have happened if a flamethrower had been used in the Aurora theater shooting rather than the two guns that were used. He said that the flamethrower would have, quote, exposed 101 individuals in 5 to 15 seconds to a 1,500-degree flame that instantly charred their skin and seared their lungs while simultaneously drenching them with flaming gasoline, end quote. Oh, unbelievable. It made me wonder, is this how this guy spends his free time? Coming up with this stuff? Anyway, I'm sorry. Get back later. I couldn't resist sharing that. I strongly disagree with your conclusion that victims are blinded. In fact, I would say that what has happened to them has opened their eyes. There is nothing like the experience of losing a loved one to shake someone to their core. I think many victims see things more clearly. They cut to the heart of an issue. They have a greater appreciation for life and have learned not to take it for granted. Which is why I cringed when I heard you testify that, quote, smaller magazines won't necessarily change the outcome of a shooting. Won't necessarily. I can't comprehend how you could acknowledge that lives might be saved, but that you still favored the high-capacity magazines over the possibility of saving human lives. Look, the victims don't live in a fantasy world where they blindly think their guns are only preventing tyranny and taking out bad guys. They live in the real world where they recognize that our great nation has a shamefully high level of gun violence. Victims live in a world where they choose to care more about protecting the lives of human beings than in defending inanimate objects. Mr. Calhoun, if you were to actually meet victims face to face, maybe you'd come to imagine how difficult it is for many of them to speak up and testify as they do. Maybe you'd discover how difficult it can be to repeat their emotional story to others in a public setting, not knowing how they'll hold up, not knowing how ill or stressed out they'll be the next day, or how difficult it can be if they don't like public speaking, or the backlash they might face from pro-gun people in their church or workplace, or even within their own family. And perhaps you learn about how many victims face scorn from gun rights activists in the form of insulting or sarcastic remarks and nasty, threatening, or even hateful letters and emails. As an aside, how would you like to sit down with me and read aloud a sampling of the pro-gun hate mail I've received over the years? Are you up for that? I believe some gun rights activists simply object to the fact that victims speak up in the first place. Perhaps because they think the public shouldn't hear of the reality of gun violence, or think it should be kept out of sight, or seen just as something that affects only gang members. Or perhaps they don't like that we remind people that gun violence can strike anyone. Look, I'm not questioning your right to say what you said that day. Naturally, it's your right to hold those opinions. But you must know that if you're going to characterize people in the way you have, you can expect to get a response. Mr. Calhoun, if you're not going to actually get to know and understand us, or imagine walking in our shoes, then you shouldn't pretend to know what's in our hearts and on our minds, or pretend to know how we seek closure. Empathy for a person's loss is indeed a noble human quality. Maybe you ought to try it out sometime. Thanks for listening. I welcome your response. I wrote this letter at the end of April. It is now mid-July. I have not received a response. And I'm not surprised and won't be surprised that I never get a response, because he doesn't have the courage to respond. These are people, he's an example of someone who can dish it out but can't take it. He doesn't want to deal with the real issue. But you can, folks. You can respond. You can drown out the people like this. Get involved in this issue. Speak out. Bring about change. Thanks for listening.